Hey, I think we're all set.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we are live. Thank you everyone for joining. As people start to trickle in and come on to the
Yeah,
channels that we have going on Facebook and YouTube, I'd like to just use up some of that time with a quick introduction. My name is Erika Fitzpatrick, and my family ranches here in Eastern Oregon, and I'm also part of the Good Grazing Makes Sense production team. I'm pretty passionate about today's topic, given the fact that we have a pretty serious issue with medusahead, and we've seen just how aggressive and damaging it can be as an invader. So today, the topic is really drilling down into tips, tricks, and tactics for treating those invasive annual grasses across the West. I'm joined by a few guests who are true experts in this field, and they'll do a longer introduction here in a second, but just quickly I'll mention we have Brian Mealor, who is the director of the Institute for Managing Annual Grasses Invading Natural Ecosystems, also called Imagine. We have Charlie Clements, who is a rangeland scientist with the USDA ARS, and Justin Hossfeld, who is Envu's Western Range Segment Manager. We also have the Good Grazing Makes Sense production team on behind the scenes, kind of helping with some of these logistics. So I'd like to take a moment to just give a quick overview of the program who has made this possible today, and that is Good Grazing Makes Sense. This program was launched by the Society for Range Management, and it really aims to provide practical, applicable, and economically feasible range solutions, range management solutions. It's really taking that valuable science and research that's been done and is being done within the Society for Range Management and getting it out, packaging it, and getting it out to the ranching community. It's been a huge benefit to me personally, and I've really had a lot of fun being involved with the program. A major perk is that it provides access to rangeland consultants to answer your personal questions, and events like this, where you have kind of direct, unfettered access to these experts. That comes in at just $75 a year. And if you're a member of one of our participating livestock associations, it's only $50 a year. We'd love to have you join us over at goodgrazing.org. And there you can learn more about the program and find out how to become a member there. We could not put on events like this without our sponsors. So quick mention of them. Make sure our audio is working okay here on our live stream. Looks like everything's good. Our sponsors include the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Natural Resource Conservation Alliance, the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative. And finally, we have the Agoro Carbon Alliance, which works as a partner in transitioning to conservation farm practices, one that meets an operation's specific needs, offers access to the carbon marketplace and income through quality verified carbon credits, provides long-term benefits to production and minimizes risks. So thank you to all our sponsors for making this possible. A core piece of what we're trying to do today is really engaged with you, the audience. And so please participate and drop any questions that you have into the comment section of either Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're joining us. And please give a little context. It'll really help these guys answer those questions if you can let them know kind of the area or the region you're in and provide a little more background that could really help narrow down the answers. We also would love to just hear where you're joining from. So if you're on with us right now, feel free to drop a comment where you're joining from. With that, I will step aside and I would love to hear from our speakers. So I will turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Erika. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this. I'm looking forward to this conversation too. Hopefully we'll get some good engagement from folks that are out listening and hopefully have some questions that we can help them answer. So I'm faculty at University of Wyoming. I actually sit in Sheridan, Wyoming. Close to my neighbor over there, Justin Hossfeld, who we'll hear from in just a few minutes. I have spent pretty much my whole career kind of working at the interface of strategic weed management in rangelands and rangeland restoration. I'll be completely honest, I did not want to do any research on invasive annual grasses at all. I kind of figured it was such a big issue and there were so many other people working on it that it's something I didn't want to dabble in any way. And being someone who focuses on research that's kind of driven by outreach and stakeholder driven research, the folks in Wyoming just really kept wanting to know more about what we were facing with cheatgrass at the time. And then when we made the shift, and I ended up in Sheridan from main campus, we just so happened to find the first self-sustaining populations of both medusahead and ventanata in the state of Wyoming in 2016, and a whole bunch of bulbous bluegrass. And so we ended up with all of these sort of crazy, non-native, non-desirable grass species that were here in our backyard. And it really kind of changed the way that we were running our program. And rather than kind of a conventional research approach where somebody asks us a question and we go spend a couple years and come back and give them a partial answer, we've really started trying to do better at overlaying some of our research framework with current land management practices and working hand in hand with people as they're doing land management to try to learn better how to manage these invasive grasses. So that's a little about the background. I think it's a really exciting time to be thinking about invasive annual grasses in rangelands. I think we've got new tools, both spatial tools, management tools. I think the awareness with some of the partners and the federal agencies is at a level right now that's higher than probably anything we've seen in decades. And I think there's some positive discussions that are coming out of really regional conversations. And I think we're feeling maybe a little more optimistic than we have in a long time. And so I am looking forward to us chatting a little bit more, and I'll pass it on to Charlie, I think.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Erika, for the invitation. This is a pretty nice opportunity. Like Erika said, my name is Charlie Clements. I'm a rangeland scientist here in Reno. I'm with the Great Basin Rangeland Research Unit. I started here about 35 years ago. I actually started the restoration of a native species, Annaul bitterbrush. I've been working on cheatgrass since day two, let's put it that way. The initial introduction and subsequent invasion of cheatgrass in the Great Basin was about 1902. And from that time forward, it has just taken over habitat over habitat. So there's some discussion out there that fire is the catalyst of cheatgrass, but really it's the loss of our perennial grasses. That's our biological suppression, if you will, of cheatgrass. So cheatgrass comes in, it carries a persistent seed bank, it mines the site, and then it provides that fine textured early maturing fuel that actually causes some of these wildfires. So with that disturbance, our perennial grasses can't, at the seedling stage, can't compete with our cheatgrass. So it's a big problem. So when we look at controlling this or decreasing this problem, we look at how do we go in and do an effective and efficient weed control program. So when I first started this in the 90s, herbicides really weren't available. So we did mechanical, we did fallows. Later, when other herbicides were available in the late 90s, we started looking at pre-emergent herbicides, which were also very successful. A big part of what we do is we have to plant material testing. We look at introduced species, we look at native species. Even though my career started with Annaul bitterbrush as a restoration and native, I'm pretty sure my career is going to end up the restoration of a perennial grass, a native one. Here at the Agricultural Research Service, one of our goals is to improve sustainability of agriculture practices. And really to do that, our goal, you have to reduce cheatgrass, reduce those fields associated with cheatgrass, and reduce the chance, the rate, the spread, and the season of wildfire. And therefore, we can improve sustainable agriculture practices. At the same time, we can improve wildlife habitat. So really, that's my gist. Yeah, I didn't think I'd be working on this 30 years either, Brian. But I'm not going to tell you that it hasn't been fun all the way. So I'll turn it over to Justin, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thanks, Charlie. And like the others, Erika, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's these are great moments to have to really talk about how we can evolve and learn from what each other's doing, and happy to be a part of it. So my past, I partnered with Brian and Charlie a lot with a lot of passion, the same as they have, to help transition these landscapes back into healthy ecosystems and more sustainable ecosystems. My career with invasive annual grasses has been more from the production side. I managed large ranches in Montana and Wyoming for a good share of my career. Like Charlie and Brian, I've spent a lot of years fighting it. Some years my attempts made me wish I had cheatgrass back by the time I got through taking it out. So learning from the pluses and the minuses. But in that, what I hope to be able to bring to the conversation is a lot of information, a lot of past experience on forage quality, on rotations and operational tools and operational ways that you complement your treatments, that you complement the way that you transition these landscapes back, because we all know that production and use still has to be part of that dynamic, and it can be done in a very complementary way, and I want to be here to help with that. So with that, Erika, I'll send it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We've already got some questions coming in, so there's not going to be a shortage here today, but we've got folks joining from Terry, Montana, Pinedale, Wyoming, Canyon, Texas, Idaho. We're really excited. It's got the full spread of locations, but to kick it off, let's start off with a question from Facebook, especially since we're talking mainly with ranchers and people managing livestock. So there's been a lot of questions around seed and the interaction of grazing and livestock with that. And so we had someone ask, when should grazing occur to be most effective? And does seed consumption and spread become a concern?
Well, I'll start with the grazing and the rotation and the impact of the cattle. We've always found that grazing, a rotational grazing system, or grazing that ecosystem or that particular pasture in sequences, is always going to be more beneficial and more productive than grazing the same pasture at the same time every year. We want to be able to give, we tend to have our cool season, our mid season, and our late season grasses. We want to give each one of them throughout our grazing cycles a chance to get to physiological maturity, to produce seed, and do just what you mentioned, Erika, is to help propagate itself. I do believe that livestock can help that, and they do tend to spread seed. I don't know that I would have a good feel, and maybe Charlie or Brian would, on their actual, the percentage of transportation that the livestock do to help propagate seed. I know they probably do, but from a percent standpoint, I don't really have a good answer for that. I think it's more the health of the ecosystem, and again, like that sequential grazing, to where the early seasons don't get a chance to dominate the mid seasons. The mid seasons don't get a chance to dominate the early seasons, to where they all get their chance to be able to propagate themselves.
Yeah, Justin, I think you hit on the timing thing really well. My suspicion is that any seed transport is likely going to be more in the fur or in mud that's attached to hooves or things like that. I'm not sure how much direct ingestion and passing through the digestive system of most of our invasive grasses that we're going to see, especially considering that most of the literature would suggest that when those seeds are mature, livestock are going to kind of avoid it anyway. I mean, you get some mechanical damage to their mouths. I think a question that I would kind of follow up with this, that we talk with our landowner partners with a lot, is, what's your goal in trying to manage your grazing when you have an annual grass problem? Like, are you trying to control and reduce your invasive grasses with grazing, or are you trying to focus on maintaining the health of your desirable perennial plants with grazing? And sometimes those two things don't necessarily meet in the middle, right? If like, I want to graze and get rid of my cheatgrass, then you're probably going to need to be in there late spring, high stock density, high utilization, like every year. And it's going to be difficult to do that and not negatively impact your cool season perennials that you're trying to maintain. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we have to think through from a grazing perspective. If you can get in there, and like Justin said, some years, if you're in a really bad situation, you might get some forage use from those annual grasses, and in some really severe situations, it might be your only option. Hopefully we're not going to be in that situation too often. And so I think those are some of the things I would think through. There's some interesting data coming out of Nevada that would suggest that fall and winter grazing alters litter dynamics a little bit. Most of our invasive annual grasses need quite a bit of litter to facilitate their establishment. And so reducing that litter layer through the fall and winter can actually reduce some of that establishment and seed production. I think those are a few of the things I would also keep in mind.
Yeah, when I look at our arid state of Nevada, most of the habitat we work in is 7 to 9 inch precip. So when you get exceptional years like this year, you got growth, and then you're going to have carryover next year. We use the grazing animal as the only tool in the landscape to contain that fuel. So availability has to do with preference, right? So your preference is, what do you have out there? So in a lot of our cases, if we hit that cheatgrass early on, it just stimulates growth, will increase tillers and stuff. But if we hit it at the right time, we can definitely reduce it. So in our salt desert shrub, if you graze it, it has no problem going to seed. If you go to the mountain brush and hit it, it won't go to seed. It's pretty much done. So it's all about fuels management on our landscape, and we got to make sure that we're not overutilizing our perennials in that system. So we're not going to go in there and graze the cheatgrass just because we got forage and hurt our perennials. That's the big part. We can't hurt our perennials. We got to somehow reduce the fuel, but increase our perennials.
Can I follow up? Do you guys have a trigger that you look for when to move out of those pastures? That's something that we've been talking about lately, is what's the trigger? What are we looking for that's like, all right, we're getting close, we need to get out of there?
So, a lot of what country we have is rest rotation, and I'm not sure that's the best. I don't mind the rotation, but if you rest a pasture, then you just have a whole pasture full of fuel. So what we try to do is we try to graze something 2 years, and then that third year we delay it until late summer, winter grazing, so we can get rid of that fuel, and then we're already past seed set.
And for me, Brian, it's always been, what threshold can the native species stand before we're harming them trying to hurt the cheatgrass? Because when we're trying to graze out those annual grasses, there's a real good chance they're over selecting the perennials as well. And it's always that risk reward is that. So I always graze to a threshold where I thought I was going to start to create harm on the perennials, and then had to move on.
Does that strategy or those triggers change kind of with the level of invasion? As far as, if you have a really heavily invaded area, or if you have an area that just has a little bit of cheatgrass and pretty good perennials, how would you recommend people think about their grazing management when you have those kind of opposite ends of the spectrum?
I'll jump in. These guys might disagree, but that's okay. That's why we're having a conversation. So, if you take the extreme examples of the invasion process, Erika, you go from a fully intact rangeland, native perennials, fully desirable, what you'd love to see. Your goal should really be grazing that in such a way that you maintain the health of that perennial plant community. Not that you don't graze it, right? We graze it in such a way that we know is sustainable. I think you probably do more damage removing grazing from those systems than you can grazing it appropriately. And if you go to the other end, where all that's left is nothing but cheatgrass, then it's like the Wild West. You can do whatever you want, as long as you can figure out how to graze in such a way that you can take care of your animals and meet their nutritional needs when they need it, right? Because there's nothing to harm at that point in time. It's just all bad guys out there. And so if you can figure out a way to use grazing as a setup for some of the seeding work, or for some of the other herbicides, because you're in full on restoration mode at that point in time, or you're just learning to use an annual grassland as your forage base. And so there's actually, you actually have way more tools in the toolbox when it's just completely trashed and demolished and you're not trying to take care of the good guys that are left. And then I would say, you know, somewhere in that intermediate portion, you're applying those principles that we were just talking about in terms of, you know, get some forage out of the annual grasses if you can, but don't do it in such a way that you're going to harm the perennial grasses. And think about fuels management and all those other things that came along. Maybe that's how I would characterize the different invasion states.
I agree with that, Brian, and because that is exactly it. So Erika, maybe I'll speak to kind of more of the middle or interim range to the early levels of infestation. I think first off, it has to be a consciousness of that infestation. Is it growing? Are you aware that it's there? And are you aware of what your habits or what your influence is doing to that infestation? And so near where Brian and I are, there's an area kind of right between us. It's right near called Acme, Wyoming. It sits kind of right up against the Montana border. We noticed that we were starting to get these infestations. Cattle would start to avoid those areas, start to overutilize the other areas, and that was only propagating the infestation. So at that point, we started using salt, mineral, kind of attractants, if you will, or some negative reinforcement. We started shutting off water, trying to move once we felt there in those invaded areas. And mind you, you can't fence a pasture according to the population of species out there. So then you have to use cultural influences, like I say, turning off water, kind of making them move to another part of the pasture, using salt, mineral, maybe some kind of a tub that they want to go to get them to start utilizing as evenly as you can. And cattle are lazy. They're going to take the path of least resistance. It's not a perfect science, but I think it is that consciousness and using those management tools to try and help not overutilize those areas that are trying to recover.
Yeah, Erika, Brian hit it perfect. It's just unfortunate in Nevada, we have a whole lot of the wrong spectrum. So we're trying to use a lot of tools, and we actually have operators that use cheatgrass 12 months out of the year. So their winter allotment, they're going to be on cheatgrass, and their summer, they're going to be on their meadows, and other places they don't have a choice. So again, our problem is going to be fuel. And that's why, you know, the research that's done on pre-emergent herbicides and other means and plant material testing, that's why it's so important in Nevada, because we have to go reclaim those sites, because they are critical to grazing management and they are critical to wildlife habitats.
I have to say I'm a little jealous of the areas that actually have just cheatgrass, only because, you know, we've seen a medusahead in about the, you know, week and a half long span that you can graze that, and just how damaging that is, because, you know, when you get to the other end of the spectrum on medusahead, it's just a word of warning. If, you know, Brian, I respect what you guys have done and jumping on it early, because anyone that has it anywhere, please try to eradicate it now, because it is, if you don't think it's nasty, just wait. It's I won't go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, we do wish we had cheatgrass back. Well, we see that the medusahead just follows cheatgrass, you know, identically. So if we have an area with it, it's just kind of an early warning for us. But that's our 2 cents. But
Erika, I'll tell you something. This research location was pretty much opened to go research medusahead in 1964. We started in 59, but in 1964, James A. Young came here to work on medusahead. They just end up putting them over on cheatgrass. But we have long-term research sites where he always warned people, think cheatgrass is bad, wait for the worst weed. And he even pushed it to centuria species, you know, the knapweeds and stuff that can come into those arid lands. So yeah, it's something that sometimes we take for granted, but you're living it.
Yeah, but it is exciting. I mean, with that transition over, you know, if we have questions come in regarding grazing, we'll circle back to it, but maybe we can kind of move into some of the tools, some of the questions we have regarding these new tools that we have available to us and strategies, especially in kind of trying to one, either restore areas or to kind of keep areas clean and healthy. And so with that, I'll go into, it's a pretty specific question, but we want to get to it. It's from Deanne on Facebook, and she's in Idaho. And they have a ventanata problem, which I hear that's even worse than medusahead. So we are sorry you have that, Deanne. She says that we have owned 20 acres for about 7 years and have been grazing steers for the last 4 years. We are currently working with the NRCS and the County Noxious Weed Department. We are going to spray Rejuvra for the first time this fall. Do I need to be concerned about the drift and pine and fir trees? And do I need to remove our steers who are currently grazing on the property before we spray?
I'll take a shot at this one, Brian, first, and then kick it to you. So as far as drift, yes, we always want to control drift as best we can. From Rejuvra as a pre-emergence herbicide, what it does is it's, as the seed germinates and the root radical emerges from the seed, it burns the tip of the root radical off, essentially making that seed inert, but has no real foliar activity on a perennial plant or on a live plant. So it isn't like a lot of post-emergence herbicide where you can get drift injury as it moves around, but we don't want Rejuvra to drift into areas that may have another use in mind in the future, because Rejuvra it persists in the soil for 3 to 4 years from one application, which is what makes it successful, but that's also what we want to keep it where we want to put it. But as far as the grazing, Rejuvra has a 0-day grazing restriction. Its toxicity is very low to humans and animals, but I really recommend that people graze first and treat second, because what can happen is you can spray Rejuvra and graze immediately after, but the livestock can move the herbicide around as they're grazing. So it works much better to graze first, get some of that litter and fuels that Charlie and Brian are talking about broken up, some of the foliage off the ground, which gets us better soil contact with the herbicide, then use the herbicide, and we don't stand the risk of livestock moving it around.
Yeah, Justin, I mean, the only thing I might add is, the question I think was geared more toward, should I remove grazing from like a toxicity standpoint? But I think the other thing to think about, I think it was Deanne, is think about your grazing strategy after you start to see some recovery from that Rejuvra. And so if just make sure that you're giving your perennial plants, hopefully your perennial plants that are there, make sure you've got perennial plants on the site that are established and able to recover. And then make sure that you're managing your grazing in such a way in those several years after treatment that you're letting those perennial grasses have some time to recover. Because if you stock too heavily or you overuse that pasture, even after you get good control, then I'm afraid that your ventanata is probably going to be one of the first things really to creep back in there after the fact.
And Brian's right. I should have expanded on that more than just the application side. But what most people do, they try to graze. They plan a Rejuvra treatment into their grazing rotation, and let's say you graze early, you make that treatment, then we always recommend that that particular piece that you treat, you graze late in the season the next year, which goes along with what Brian said. So you can get that full season worth of growth. That plant can tiller, it can kind of somewhat go to maturity, it can set on roots, it can get that chance to get rooted and get reestablished before it suffers grazing pressure again. We know that is always that. There's not every world's the same, and it's not a perfect world to be able to do that. But giving that ecosystem a chance to recover is very important, because the first thing that's going to come back on those perennials is a lot of new growth, and that is like ice cream to cattle. They are going to focus on that new growth, and that's what's really going to start to hold your recovery back.
Yeah, both Brian and Justin hit it perfect. We don't have a ventanata problem in Nevada. I'm sure we will, a few locations. But what I really see with Rejuvra is its ability to combat those annuals and release those limited resources in our air environments. So you got to be careful when you're grazing, because this year our perennial grasses in the Rejuvra plots were green every month of the year. Last year they dried out about August 10th, and they were green again by September 1st. So I think the first year you definitely want to rest those. And then after that, you have to do judicious grazing.
Yeah, Justin, move over to the side. Let them see the X behind your head. So that green is like all, well, mostly Western wheatgrass, and then the tan and the yellow is all ventanata and cheatgrass and Japanese brome. So that's what your pasture can potentially look like. And you think the cows aren't going to get, if they didn't have it fenced off, the cows were just going to go straight and hang out on that X if they had the chance.
That's right. And that over selection, they don't have a conscious sense of what they're supposed to eat and not eat. They're going to select what they like to eat. So.
This was a pretty pointed question that came in, but it kind of gets right to the heart of the very tool we're talking about. But this is probably for you, Justin. Someone asked, does Rejuvra really work the way the ad says it does? And what are some of the pitfalls of trying to use it? I would kind of add to that, just, maybe when is the time, Brian mentioned it, when are some times or places that people should maybe consider not using it? And again, speaking to that X behind you, I think just giving people a little more feel for that herbicide.
You bet. So yes, I'm going to say that Rejuvra does work as advertised, but we have to support every tool we use, whether it's Rejuvra, whether it's herbicides we've had in the past, whether it's grazing, whether it's fire, anything we're going to use, we have to invest in that tool and support that tool. And Rejuvra is no different. But that X behind me that you saw was treated in 2019. That photo was taken in 20, I think it was taken in July of 2021 during one of the driest summers we had. And so it demonstrates the level of success that we can have. But Rejuvra needs an opportunity to get into the soil, get activated, and be there to stop the germination. And if it's getting trapped on litter, if we're applying it at the wrong time of the year, if we're not using the right amount of water volume to give it a chance to get it dispersed correctly and get it applied, we can see some variable control, or we can maybe see it not be successful. There's a lot of variability in these environments, and we want to give that tool the best opportunity to deal with that variability. And really it is just get it applied during as close to moisture cycles as you can so it can get incorporated. Try and work with that litter and that foliage on top of the ground as the best you can so it's not as much of an interference. And if you have germination of species already, maybe you're adding a post-emergence herbicide like a Mazapic to help control that. So that's my answer on can Rejuvra work and what makes it successful. That is it. Areas where we would not want to use Rejuvra, probably first and foremost, is when we don't have a reasonable or recoverable, I'll say this, recoverable stand of perennial species. That is not a good place for Rejuvra. Rejuvra is a great tool to help stop the transition to these monocultures, to support let's say a somewhat challenged stand, to support in its recovery. But if we don't have a good stand of perennials or desirable species to repopulate, we don't want to create bare ground, because Rejuvra does do its job well enough that it'll create bare ground fairly easily. And we don't want to have erosion. We don't want to have the things that can come from that. The other time we want to make sure we phase Rejuvra correctly, or seeing it the right tool in the toolbox. If you're going to do a seeding project, or if you're counting on some perennial seed growth and seed reestablishment, Rejuvra needs to follow that, not lead that, because Rejuvra is, it really ultimately is non-selective. It's going to stop the perennial or desirable seeds from germinating just as much as it's going to stop the annual grasses. And so if we think that we don't have a recoverable stand of perennials or desirables, we'll want to go in, use a short-term, maybe post-emergence herbicide to challenge the annuals and get establishment of the perennials. And then after they're established, come in with Rejuvra and help protect them or save them from reinfestation.
Do you have any, oh, excuse me, Charlie.
No.
Go ahead.
Justin said it perfect. I would just add, in Intermountain West, we have miles and miles of green strips that were applied for field breaks, and Rejuvra is a perfect tool to go back over the top of those, because you still have your green strip species. And what it does, takes those annuals out, it reinvigorates that whole green strip. So it actually extends the length of the effectiveness of those green strips.
If I have anything to add, we've applied Rejuvera just about every non-snow covered month of the year, and I like earlier treatments if you're going with Rejuvera alone in our part of the country where you can get it incorporated into the soil. If we go with that sort of traditional timing of late summer, early fall, a lot of times we won't really see the best results 1 year after treatment, and we start to really see the effectiveness mature in the second year after. And so if we're going out with straight indaziflam or Rejuvera, I kind of like to suggest folks try to go out a little earlier. We were always hesitant to go out too early with something like Plateau because it degrades in the sunlight. So if we put it out on the soil and it was just laying on the soil or laying on the plant material, then the sun would break it down and we would lose our efficacy. And if we can time it with some earlier rain events, I think we get a little bit of a jump start, at least in our different research trials that we've done with Rejuvera. That'd be the only. I think there was a question about does it really work and when can you apply it. That was the only thing I would add.
And when we talk about that, having that recoverable stand, sometimes for us, it's been a little hard to determine that line, that cutoff of saying, is this going to work or not? Do you guys have any suggestions for one, either determining that, or do you do a test plot? I mean, what would you guys recommend when you're not exactly sure if it's too weak of a stand of perennials?
So what we recommend is that just what you said, Erika, if you don't feel confident in what you have there to repopulate and recover, then scientists will call it a bioassay, but we recommend doing a strip, or like you did there up above, up there above your house, where you do that strip and just see what that recovery is. Always keep in mind when you're doing these test strips, you have to manage the outcome of these test strips, because they're not going to be your whole pasture. They're not going to be your whole ranch. And then once you do this and the annual grasses are gone and we start to see the recovery, you have to manage that area to where you're not harming it by using it as a test strip. But we always do say, if you're in question, test it first before you do large acres. But I will say, like the X behind me, if you were to go out in that before we treated it, you would have called that a very degraded site. You would have said that site had lost most of its energy and was kind of right on the borderline of whether it could recover or not. It always amazes me how much resiliency, how much energy these perennial native systems have in them, that if you'll just take that competition away, and as we know, these annual grasses tend to keep these ecosystems in like a constant state of drought. They're parasites, and they're very opportunistic, meaning whenever there's going to be a favorable event for the ecosystem, they're taking it all. And when we take them out, it's amazing to see how many plants were there. They're just dormant. They're just waiting their time. They're waiting their chance to recover, and then they come in. But that I want to say, don't give up on a stand, because it's always amazing how much energy is left in it. But again, you have to find a comfort level with that, and a test strip might be the best way you do it.
Charlie, did you want to jump in on that one?
I would just add that in all of our cases, when we have to control the invasive weeds and we have a release of residual, we seed on top of it because the invasive weeds already took over that density. So we have to thicken up the density to have further suppression. So that in our systems, we don't have a whole lot of creeping like Western wheatgrass or something. But when you're looking at blue bunch wheatgrass or some of your bluegrasses, really you have to thicken those up, because that's going to be your biological suppression of the invasive weeds.
Yeah, I was going to say it kind of depends on what species you have on the site. I mean, in parts of, as we're transitioning kind of toward the east and moving into northern Great Plains type grasslands, we end up with a way higher component of rhizomatous perennials. and they just really respond very well to something like Rejuvra. And like Charlie said, the bunch grasses, they don't fill in as quickly, and you might have to augment those. Erika, your question is not just your question. There's been thousands of hours of PhD and graduate student research trying to figure out what's the number. Like I've seen things like 1 bunch grass per square meter gives you sufficient recovery potential. That seems a little thin to me. I think the key is one, doing the test strip like you guys were talking about, but also I think it points out the importance of doing some pre-treatment assessments. I mean, you can't just drive by a pasture and assume everything's going to turn out the way you want it. And really, in some of those high production years, you kind of have to dig down through the annual grasses because those perennials are so suppressed. They're topped over by an annual grass canopy and you don't see them. And those are the ones you're trying to release from that competition, really, with any of the herbicides that we're going to be applying, not just this specific tool.
Awesome. I'll just do a quick shout out. We have a couple other people joining us from California and Utah. And regarding your comment there, Brian, we were just talking, the conversation previous to this, we were talking about how do you assess the ground that you have and try to kind of set a strategy before you dive into the tactics. And so if anyone's interested, please reference that on our channel of content wherever you're joining us. But there we were really talking about using RAP, the Rangeland Analysis Platform, or other tools like it to really help assess what you have, or to get an idea if you're talking about a large space, and then obviously ground truth. But do you guys have any other suggestions on really getting a good idea, like you said, ahead of a project, or ahead of applying any kind of treatment, and then during and after? How have you guys seen the most success of people kind of monitoring that and the success of the project?
If I may start, you guys can jump in. RAP is an amazing tool. It's changed the way we can look at rangelands throughout the Western U.S. It breaks down when you start getting to small scales and trying to make decisions about individual pastures. It's not designed for that. I mean, you read the material about it, it says don't use it for that. We are still very big proponents of getting out there and doing on the ground monitoring of your rangelands, and that's monitoring ahead of treatments. It's going out and looking after treatments. I actually hire like a small army of undergraduate students every year, and we in Wyoming we've been able to provide some monitoring support through our student network to folks that are working cooperatively on invasive annual grass management around the state. I think we collected data at almost 9,000 locations this year alone. And so I know that's not realistic for everyone, but for an individual landowner that already knows their property and they know where their problems are. I mean, even something as simple as some of the photo point monitoring techniques that we talk about in SRM all the time to cover by life form or functional groups. I really think in many cases, there's no substitute for getting out there with your feet on the ground and knowing what's happening in your pasture. I will say that there's a lot of work on other remotely sensed products. We're doing some research in that area. A whole bunch of really intelligent people are. I know Envu's got some products that are derived from satellite imagery. But I will say that trust but verify any of that stuff. I would even say that about any of the things that we put out, is you need to make sure that it's making sense on your own place and in your own experience as well.
I agree with that. And as Brian said, we're working on geospatial solutions as well. That technology is in a pretty steep curve. We're learning more and we're getting better imagery all the time, but it is still a trending tool. It's still an assessment tool. It is not going to replace the scouting that you need to do when you start to make the kind of impact you're going to make with these treatments. But so on the ground is very key. The one thing that I'll add to on the ground is be on the ground. Think about timing when you're going to be on the ground to see that presence. We can go out and do a very very robust and a very extensive job of scouting. And if we're scouting at the wrong time, we may be diminishing our efforts to see what we want to see. So when you're going to scout, think about the right time to scout. And a lot of times that can be in the fall. In the spring sometimes can be really hard to scout in. There's so much growth, there's so much expression from everything. But again, that depends on the region. When we talked about applying during a moisture cycle, our moisture cycles are in the spring. Some people's moisture cycles are in the fall. It really does need to be your region. But Brian's right. You still can't replace being boots on the ground. But the next thing I want to bring on from that is, then what? We get that good assessment, then what? Then we need to look at that area we want to restore and recover from a management standpoint, from a holistic standpoint. We don't want to create big patches of bare ground as we restore it, so that boots on the ground gives us that ability to recognize that. But on the same token, we don't want that percentage of ground that could be bare ground leave everything else at risk, because the longer we leave that in the state it's in, the more decline we're having in the perennials, the closest we are to the Wild West and the good, bad, and ugly that Ryan talked about, where we've lost that. So then it's starting to think about management plan, grazing plans, your application map to leave out those areas that are really high risk, and then how are you going to manage it after treatment. So it is that underground assessment, but then it start thinking through what you get after you have that assessment.
Yeah, I'm a 99% behind on the ground assessment. I'm old, so the new tools are kind of out of my wheelhouse. But we were out on a project, and the land manager was told this was a complete failure. Go ahead and put your stock out there and go to town. And we went and walked the ground and showed him all the plants that we actually seeded that he wanted. And we kept the stock off the ground. And 2 years later, he had a fully stocked perennial grass stand. So you wouldn't see that from the air. I tell my wildlife friends this all the time because they like to fly and count animals. But from the air, I got hair, but when you get on the ground, you see that's not the case. So don't laugh, Brian.
Oh, that's awesome. We have a follow-up question from Deanna. Remember, she asked about the drift question and the grazing. So she followed up and asked, would it be better to overseed and not have bare ground in spots, because we do have some recoverable stands, and cross graze before applying Rejuva?
The answer is yes. Any of those high-risk areas or areas you think they could turn into bare ground, by all means, take whatever effort you can to get establishment of perennial desirable species before you use Rejuva.
Yeah, make sure you give it enough time for them to get good roots down too.
In general, what are we talking about timing wise on that? I know I'm sure it's area dependent, but I mean, can you give a ballpark at all for folks to be considering?
So we always recommend one life cycle, one growth season. Let that plant go through one full growth cycle. You could say 1 year's worth of growth where it came out of dormancy, grew, and went dormant again. That gave it a chance to do what it can best do to get set. But Brian and Charlie both brought up this earlier, that some species may need longer than that. Some species a little shallow rooted, some species are a little slower to get established. They maybe need 2 seasons. But for most grasses, what we've seen, if you give them 1 full year's worth of growth and rest, they usually get to be pretty tolerant or of then a Rejuva treatment and whatnot. I guess the reason why I tend to want to always say that with some caution is, if you wait much longer, the annual grass reinfestation can start to be so severe that it starts to take away what you're starting to gain. There's a point where you'll only gain so much, and then you start to lose. And so I think that's why I tend to say that, partly because when I say 1 year or one growth cycle, these annual grasses are annual grasses. So that you're protecting from them through one growth cycle. But if you try to go into the next one, now they're back.
Yeah, I would say that on top of what Justin said is, it goes right back to being boots on the ground, because, what's your periodicity amount of precip that you got? How successful was your seeding that first year? In a lot of our cases, we're going to defer the second year just so we'll get a little bit more root development. Again, majority of what we're seeding in is always under 10 inches precip. When I get into a 12-inch zone, we have a lot more success. I might only do 1 year and then have them do the hot summer after that. So
in terms of time from seeding to following up with Rejuvra, or in terms of seeding and then being able to come in and graze?
seeding and coming into graze.
Okay. I guess I was thinking along the follow-up. Were you guys doing some seeding and then subsequent gaps after seeding before you sprayed Rejuvra? Because we're doing some of that. Are we doing
We did it the opposite. We did it a 1 year, 2 year,
Plant
3 year
back.
fallow.
plant back? Okay.
Yeah. Just because, Justin says don't do this, but of course we did. We went to a place that had no residual plants. So yeah, we had great control and it got better, but we had no residual. So we still had activity of the herbicide. So if the seeding failed, we went back. So, we showed Harry this summer. We had success in 1 year fallow, 2 year fallow, and 3 year fallow. And we couldn't make sense of any of it. So yeah, it's probably we should be doing what you're doing.
Well, we did.
Go post.
We did the exact. We've got 1, 2, and 3 years after application seedings here too that we've been messing with, and then we got really impatient and we thought, how fast can we come in after we see emergence of seeded species and apply Rejuvra? And here's the logic, Justin. You tell me. So if we don't get Rejuvra out early enough, and our cheatgrass comes up or ventanata comes up, it escapes it.
Yep.
Right. That's fine. It's fine that first year. It escapes it. Roots gets down below the Rejuvra layer or whatever. So we're like, why can't we do that with natives too? And so we planted, and then as soon as we saw emergence, we came in like every 2 weeks and started spraying Rejuvra after that. The jury is still out. It's still the first year that we started doing that. But I think Justin's counsel is probably more wise in that you want to give it enough time to let those roots develop. But that gap, so like opening, we talk about opening an establishment window, and that's that gap that Justin is talking about. And you got to get those natives established, and you've got to recapture that site protect it before all the invasive annuals come back and start to compete again. So we've tried both ends of the candle on that one. And I guess stay tuned. We'll try to we post. I don't want to do a plug, but we put research updates on invasivegrasses.com. That's our website for Imagine. So if you're interested in like seeing research updates as things come out before they ever get published, visit our website every now and then, and you kind of see how these things are turning out.
That is a perfect plug, because we actually had a question about that. Someone expressing some frustration that it's hard to find the most up-to-date research. And just like this conversation, there's research that's ongoing, and there's some frustration, especially if we're not as familiar with academia, how to really access that. And so thank you. Do you all have any other resources or places that people can kind of reference and kind of watch the updates as this continues to evolve?
So we do, on the Envu site, we have these virtual plot tours where we go out into a lot of work Brian's done, Charlie's done, others have done, we've done, and do a lot of just what we're talking about and talk about that. So, and we update those all the time. And then anytime they want to reach out to any of us at Envu, we have a myriad of publications that we update continually on Brian's new research, on Charlie's research, on Dan's research, that we keep posting and keep that updated. We can send that to people as well. And if they reach out to us, we can be more specific with what they send them. So I very much agree and understand that this is a very dynamic space, and with a lot of knowledge and a lot going on in there. So it's hard to find exactly what you want, but don't be discouraged. Reach out to Brian's group, Charlie, to us. We can help you zero in on what you need to know.
Brian, could you repeat that site one more time? It didn't sound too complicated, but we want to make sure we get it in the comments here.
It was way more complicated when it was on a university site, but now so it's invasivegrasses.com.
Perfect.
That'll take you right to our Imagine homepage, and we've got summary of all our programs and different partnerships and things like that there.
Awesome. We have a couple of other questions. It's nice to kind of group these things as we go. We had some, questions regarding some current research or research that's been done specifically. And so we had someone ask, and I'm completely unfamiliar with any of this, so I'm just going to ask it. They said, whatever happened to the soil bacteria that Ann Kennedy over at WSU licensed out just before she retired? Is it being used anywhere? Is anyone familiar with that?
I guess I'll stick it. I'll step in this one somewhat.
Thanks, Brian.
So the product is it's called Pseudomonas fluorescens. It's a hypothetically a weed suppressive bacteria. It is currently still available from a company in Idaho, I think. I don't remember the name of the company, so I can't say it. I'm not sure who it is, but I will say that the evidence, the scientific evidence for the efficacy of Pseudomonas fluorescens as a annual grass suppressive product is not very strong evidence that it's effective in rangeland settings. There's if they really want to dig into it, there's an entire special issue of Rangeland Ecology and Management focused specifically on that particular tool, and they can find pretty much all the details they want in that article. I don't know if that was made open. What do you call it? Open source or whatever. It's not behind the paywall. I don't remember what it's called. But that would be one place to get very detailed information for that. There is still ongoing research into that Pseudomonas product and different formulations. Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
I agree with Brian. I used some when I was ranching. I had some decent success with it. I've had some marginal to no success. It's very susceptible to the environment, and as we know, the environments are really variable in range and pasture, and I think that's a struggle. But I also agree with Brian. Their continued research is going on. We've always talked every tool in the toolbox will have value. That if that one could become more consistent and more reliable, it could be a great way to get establishment prior to using some of the other tools. So we don't ever want to tell anyone that nothing doesn't have value, but right now dependability is the biggest struggle with that one. And Perfect. I think it's called Battalion Pro. I think I could look that up.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Another research related question is, there was a lot of buzz going on about carbon coated seeding. Is that commercially available or close? And how does that tie in with a reseeding strategy or herbicide treatments?
Well, Brian and I, and probably Charlie, Brian and I know both of us have done some work with that. I've seen some success with it. It's expensive. It's tough to do in a large scale on large landscape ways. I wouldn't call it commercially available. I think when you're getting carbon coated seeds, you're going out and commissioning that to happen and getting somebody to coat that seed. And really, I think where this really starts to, I think there's one thing that kind of cuts to the chase before carbon coated is how are you putting on the seed? If you're drill seeding it versus broadcast seeding it versus what time of year versus livestock traffic that could maybe walk the seed in versus not, I think those questions probably almost need to be answered first before you start looking at carbon coated seed. Like I said, I've seen some real success with it. I've seen it not be that successful, but the scalability was probably the biggest issue I saw with it.
Yeah, our friends in Burns, Oregon really are at the forefront of this. So they're the ones really to talk to. We do have some seed out. I look at coating seed more of a dispersal benefit to certain seeds like winterfat or gaddy grass or something like that. When it comes to coating the seed so you can spray and have a 1 year thing, where you seed the grass and then you spray on top. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to get the seed down to 2 inches, kind of below the herbicide level, and see if that isn't a little bit more beneficial than the cost of coating seed.
Awesome. We had another question about, if you have a problem area right through the fence, well, whoever that may be, how do you recommend kind of managing for that when you're really trying to make progress in your area, and any tips for mitigating that?
Peer pressure. Man, I love this story. So we work with a big working group in Northeast Wyoming focused on ventanata and medusahead, and the sense of urgency was high, right? If it was cheatgrass or Japanese brome, everybody's like, whatever, we've had it, we don't care, we got plenty of western wheatgrass left. But when the two new ones kind of showed up, then everybody's urgency ratcheted up pretty quickly, and we were fortunate enough that we got an emergency label for rangeland use for those two species for indaziflam before the full rangeland label was available. So we were doing aerial applications pretty early and learning a lot. And there's these two rancher neighbors, and one calls his neighbor over, and they're on this fence line, and it looks like that line behind Justin's head, and one side's sort of pinkish yellow with nothing but ventanata, and then the other side where they had treated the year before is green and lush, beautiful grasses. And the one neighbor says, if you don't do something about your ventanata, I don't think we can be friends anymore. And so neighbor relations, that sense of community, sometimes it takes an early adopter or an innovator to show the benefit of some of these different approaches. And so if you got that champion in the community that is willing to take a chance and show that they have some benefit, and they've seen some very positive response from whatever, pick your management approach, and that they can make some forward progress with this very serious issue, I think that goes a lot longer than like eggheads that just count grass and do statistics talking to them about things. I will also say that, and I think maybe that's part of the reason this question came about. It's much bigger than just a weed problem. I mean, it's a wildlife problem. It's an ecosystem services problem. It's a fire and human safety problem, and it's bigger than any one landowner. And so I've had the great fortune of working with a bunch of cooperative groups that have dozens or even 100 different landowners involved, and everybody sitting down and talking through strategy and figuring out what are the best ways they can try to make a difference at large scales, because it's kind of a weakest link problem. And that if Charlie, on my box here with all the Zooms, if Charlie's not doing anything over on this side, and Justin and I are working really hard, and he's just going to keep having seed coming over onto us, then just figuring out how to get everybody on the same page, I think goes a long way. I don't know, that I have to tell that's one of my favorite stories.
Well, and it's a great story. I always enjoyed it. And I think I know the two people that were talking, so that even makes it a better story. But so to go along with Brian's exactly right. It is pressure. Sometimes it's with vinegar, sometimes it's with honey, but it's not giving up. What I also find, sometimes you got to help a person help you. And I think when you run into that neighbor who's not joining the effort, or is not kind of embracing this situation like you are, it's maybe helping him understand what his options are. Does he know there's cost share opportunities out there to do that? Does he know there's other kinds of assistance? Because maybe they don't, because there's a lot of forces pulling on all of us, and all of us have different forces that drive our decisions. And maybe there's something legitimate that's holding that person back, and helping him understand what that is, and maybe there's a solution to it. Goes right along with what Brian said. It's that collaborative effort in knowing what your options are.
Yeah, in Nevada, we're 89% public land, so we still have a whole lot of checkerboard. So when you have a neighbor that's mismanaging their perennials and you end up with cheatgrass, like Justin said, it hurts the whole system, because we got somebody that's pretty judicious. He's got a great project going on. He manages everything right, but his neighbor's got a wildfire hazard. Well, in a matter of 10 years, that habitat burned 4 times or twice. So he was out of grazing for 4 years out of 10. Well, an operation can't sustain that. So it's that peer pressure, and it's also that information that you can give the neighbor. And, once you introduce them to, concepts of restoration, rehabilitation, how sustainability is better than, the road he's going down. We usually find about 80% of the time those landowners come over on our side of the fence and start rehabbing their sites.
I would say awareness that there are options to do things too. And Justin had made a great point about other limitations, but you can look back in the rangeland literature in the 40s, and people are throwing their hands up and saying, we can't do anything about invasive grasses. We're done. If you got it, just give it up. Can't do anything. Right. And I think that there's some great examples on this call and others all around the West that people are getting positive results from any different number of treatments. And so sharing some of those stories so that people know that it's not just a foregone conclusion that you've lost all hope and you can't ever do anything. So being a little more positive maybe and being proactive, don't wait until it gets to where it's nothing but annual grasses on there. Do something while you still have an opportunity to recover some of those healthy perennial grasses. If you have the opportunity, I think being a little more proactive is probably better than just, woe is me, I'm done. All I'm going to have is cheatgrass and ventanata medusahead.
I'll send out a last call here for our online audience for any other questions, but we've got just a few others here before we wrap up. And so it kind of ties into what we're talking about, but cost and time, I would say can really be prohibitive for people, sometimes tackling this issue. Sometimes it falls to the bottom of the budget or the bottom of the time frame that you have available to devote to it. So there's not a lot of solutions for time, but on the cost side of things, are there programs? You guys said there's lots of movement and excitement around tackling this issue. You have any recommendations on programs or other ways to kind of offset that cost for folks to make it more accessible, especially when we're talking about herbicide treatments?
I'll get started, guys, because as you know, Brian, we're working on that a lot. But so there's a lot of different opportunities. I think the first funding channel people think of is the NRCS and like EQIP or TIPS or RCPP, which are programs that the federal government has out for restoration, ecosystem services, watershed health, perennial wildlife improvement. Those are great programs, and recently had a lot of money just infused into those programs through the Inflation Reduction Act, but they can have some pretty strict sideboards, and they already have kind of a cadence that they're moving along at, and sometimes it takes time to get in. I mean, you apply one year, you maybe get the money the next year. If they have a full list of applicants that year, you might have to wait till next year to get in there, and so there can be some issues with going that way. But there is a lot of restoration grants out there, a lot of wildfire defense grants, a lot of wildlife grants out there. There is a lot of money circulating out there that isn't always very visible, but once you start looking for it, you can find it. And my biggest advice is there are key people I know in every community that you can go talk to. If you can't find them, they know where they're at. And I think the biggest thing is don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid, whether it's your county agent, whether it's a local wildlife group like Pheasants Forever or Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. They all have that same desire we have for restored, healthy ecosystems that are sustainable for both production and wildlife. And so they're going to know a lot of these funding sources as well. So I know that's a lot to a very simple question, but it's a pretty dynamic space. So don't be afraid to ask, and don't be afraid to look for those funding choices.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on that?
I'm trying to think of some trends that we've seen and that I'm hearing being discussed kind of at federal levels. It seems like there is likely to be an increased probability for these larger cooperative groups that can articulate a strategy in how they're going to approach something at large scales. So a group of landowners and agency folks come together and they lay out a clear strategy and say, look, it's not just going to be me doing this. Will you give me some money? It's, we've got this clear strategy and we're going to affect an entire watershed, and this is how we're going to implement it. I think that type of program is going to have a higher likelihood of getting some larger grant dollars in doing it that way. And you're probably going to have a group of people that is more aware of those opportunities and can tap into some of those funds moving forward too. I just, I mean, there's some legislation kind of in the works now that's going to potentially shake free additional dollars toward restoration focus with invasive annual grasses and wildfire fuels. That's being discussed now. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities even in places, like Charlie was talking about. They're predominantly federal land, and I think the funding is likely to follow the awareness and the emphasis on the impact of invasive annual grasses. And I know you didn't want to go like huge scale, Erika, but there's been some publications recently that have come out that have made some very striking claims about loss of sagebrush rangeland ecosystems to the tune of, million plus acres per year being degraded. And the number one driver of that degradation is invasive annual grasses and their downstream ecological effects. And so, I think when I was growing up, it was all about, save the rainforest or, whatever and the loss of ecosystem on a scale that's probably similar to what we were looking at with rainforest degradation is happening. And so I think we have to wrap our minds around that and figure out ways that we can kind of be a little more proactive and continue to support these good programs that all of us are learning how to do this better and trying to implement on the landscape. I think that's sort of my big broad view.
And sorry, Charlie, I'm just going to be real quick and then I'm going to kick the ball to you. But to build on Brian's point, that might mean that you're going to have to kind of put some baggage behind you, strip your armor off, and you're going to be talking with and dealing with people maybe you've not always dealt with or didn't always see that you're going to align with. But if you want to be successful, you have to have that willingness to do that. It's going to take all partners. So.
Yeah, the real approach to all this is going to be team effort. And so you're going to have to, build a team. Here in Nevada, our wildlife agency, our state wildlife agency, is one of the best partners there is. They not only got all the wildlife groups that, Justin was talking about that are donating money, well, they're getting matching funds. So just our state agency alone puts over $1 million a year into habitat. And so we have a lot of money coming to the state. We have a lot of money coming to the feds. And just last week we did a project and we ran it through the conservation district. So there's all those opportunities. You just have to be good at planning and you have to have a little patience.
Yeah, and I really like, Charlie, that you mentioned, the wildlife side of things. This is one of those issues where if you're improving wildlife habitat by managing annual grasses, in almost every case, we're also improving the grazing resources for ranchers too,
Absolutely.
like inseparable. And so,
Brian, that's what we've kind of been saying for a long time, that my background is wildlife management actually. So I work for an ag place, so we're supposed to improve sustainable agriculture practices. But I tell them, if I improve wildlife habitat, I'll improve sustainable agriculture every time. And we just had a mule deer summit in Nevada because we got the only declining big game species in North America. And it's not a new thing, it's just been going on. And our state agency, our wildlife people, they have put this on their shoulders and they're going forward with it. And they're supporting research, but they're leading by action. And that's something that's different. 9 years ago, we did a tour. A guy was retiring and he said, before I go on this, this little tour, I wanted to show you my projects. Well, 10 years earlier, we looked at 7 projects. He failed on six of them. 9 years later, we looked at 6 projects. He succeeded on 5. So like you said earlier, we're promoting the positives of it, grab onto the positives, work on the negatives. We're seeing great progress. not just in plant material development, methodologies of seeding, but also what folks are doing as far as developing tools like, Rejuva and others to go out there and actually combat those invasive weeds.
Oh, that's fantastic. We have one last relatively specific question, but I see it kind of tying into, being one more way to have a conversation with a neighbor or a family member or whoever it may be, and really making these decisions about going forward with treatment. So that question was, they'd like to know if there are any calculations of any kind on return on investment for Rejuva based on production pounds or otherwise.
I know Brian, Tanner's done a little work on that. We have, so maybe I'll start with what we've done. Erika, really depends on the site on to get at that real ROI number, but almost across the board, we've seen a very credible return on investment from the use of Rejuva, because not only just from a sheer more amount of forage to graze, because we need that, but a much higher quality of forage quality. And when we get higher forage quality, and ungulates actually consume less because they meet their nutritional need sooner. So now they put less pressure on the ecosystem. They become a better stakeholder within that ecosystem. But with that higher forage quality, the livestock performance is better. So, if you're talking a cow and a calf operation, that cow's going to milk better, that calf's going to gain better. There's a definite financial reward from that comes back to the return on investment. I think the other big return on investment we've seen and we've done a ton of analysis, many of them, on different sites and different types of grasses and different forage sources, is when that forage quality is higher and they're consuming less grass, pastures last longer, you're more flexible with your rotation. And what I've always said is now those annual grasses aren't managing you are managing the resource. And that is probably where you can find your biggest return on investment, is when you are in control, when you're managing it, when you're being proactive and thoughtful with your actions, as opposed to reactive and just trying to get through every year, trying to just squeak by to get to the next year. And because there's so many different ways you can find a return on investment. Let's say, you have more grass, but you really can't increase your stocking rate. You don't have enough hay to really increase your stocking rate. You don't have the labor to increase your stocking rate. You're so sick of calving that many cows, you don't want to increase your stocking rate. Operationally, you're just there, but you could, on good years, lease grass to someone for pasture cattle. You may have extra hay that you can sell for cash flow throughout the summer. You could have heavier weaning weights. There's so many different ways that you can find a return on investment. And why it's so meaningful to me is when you improve that core resource, you're improving every single aspect of your range. You didn't just improve a hay field. You didn't pick the best bull you could buy to improve your genetics. You didn't buy the best swather or baler to put up better hay. You improved all those things when you improve that resource, and that's where we see the best return on investment. So I think a simple answer although I never gave it, my last answer wasn't simple, but to simplify it is, when it puts you back in the control and you can be a good manager, that's when you see your best return on investment.
Yeah, to support some of the things Justin said, I had a PhD student, Tanner Hart, who he spent a bunch of summers like clipping grass in treated and non-treated plots every month and doing nutritional analyses and stuff like that. Much higher forage quality and palatability on sites where we shifted from annual grass dominance to perennial grass dominance later into the year. I mean, the nutritional quality and palatability, especially ventanata dominated sites, just drops off very quickly in what I would say late spring, early summer. And then, as Charlie was talking about, they had a great year there this year. I mean, our perennial grasses in most cases held on to their protein and TDN and all the things we would look for much later into the season than the annuals did. And with a successful ventanata control program, we switched it from 60+% ventanata dominance on a site to where there's less than 1% ventanata and the rest are perennials. And so that carried that nutritional quality and palatability carried all the way through. And then Tanner also translated that into Justin's complex answer probably even oversimplifies the decision making when it comes to this return on investment thing. I mean, I'm just kind of, it's really hard to wrap your mind around, values of what you're recovering. But if Tanner really did a really simplified analysis, even though he would probably argue with that, basically of, do you control ventanata in these transitional sort of northern plains grasslands, or do you buy supplemental hay that you would have lost due to lost forage, right? Pretty straightforward. And looking at a 3-year control window in our eco region, in almost every situation, whether you were using relatively low utilization rates or moderate utilization rates, in almost every situation, it made more sense to control your ventanata than it did to purchase extra hay. And I know it's not a realistic decision. It's not always just to do this or do that. I think as we move into less productive rangeland sites, that forage trade-off is going to look a lot different. And so as a landowner, if I'm in a highly invaded landscape, I'm going to contradict a whole bunch of other things right here for a second. But so if I'm worried about grazing and improving my forage capacity, I'm probably going to invest first in those sites that are my more productive, higher site potential rangelands that are already infested by invasive grasses, because that's where I'm going to get my biggest return from a forage standpoint. Right? I got, good loamy soils, deep loamy soils somewhere that are dominated by cheatgrass, but I've got good perennials. I'm going to go spend some dollars there because from a grazing standpoint, I'm going to get more return on that investment. From an invasion standpoint, like spreading into new areas, from a spatial spread standpoint and a prevention of future loss standpoint, it's probably going to make more sense to hit some of those new invasions and get to the edge and keep it from moving into those sites that are not invaded. So there's a little bit of sort of trade-off that landowners and land managers have to think through. And I think part of that is sort of your scale at which you are operating and at which you're making your decisions. But I mean, if Erika, you said you guys have medusahead. If you found the very first medusahead on your ranch that was ever there and you pulled it and it never went to seed, you're way farther ahead than if you just didn't find it and you let it start to reproduce and establish some of those impacts that it was going to have. So I think those are some of the trade-offs that we need to think through from a return on investment standpoint.
Yeah, when we look at investments in this arid state, I can tell you that one is we're trying to increase flexibility. So if we can get a site that's got pretty good potential and increase it, decrease the invasive weeds, we're going to increase capability. If we're in a site that's completely annual grass dominated and we can convert it to perennial grass dominance, we're going to increase our flexibility. And what my livestock producers tell me all the time is that when we increase the forage base, because our stocking rate never decreased in a lot of these places, but the sagebrush came in or we had fires, we had to increase that forage base. So we actually took habitat that you might use for 6 weeks, and next thing you know, we're using it for 12 weeks, same number of cattle. So there's your investment. And what one rancher told me, he says, Charlie, on top of that, we've decreased my attorney fees. So I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's all part. Saving money can be a return on investment. That's right.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground tonight. Selfishly, I'd love to keep you on here all night. We probably shouldn't do that. Are there any questions that weren't asked that you all think we should be thinking about, especially if we're thinking about taking that first step into making a move on treating invasives on your place? Is there any questions that we didn't ask today that you think we should be considering?
I guess I'll jump in. There was once a wise man once said, it's better to keep your mouth shut and let them think you a fool than open your mouth and remove all doubt. Well, I guess I'm going to remove all doubt. But I think one thing is it's a big elephant with a lot of bites, and it's hard to know where to start eating that elephant. And I think that's really the first thing that a person needs to find their comfort level with is how am I going to attack this problem, both financially, operationally, and from the environment, you know, to make sure that I'm making the best impact, because you're serving a lot of masters. You're serving your operational demand and needs. You're trying to be a good steward of the land and support the wildlife outcome. You also have a cash flow issue and the legacy of the ranch that you have to protect. And sometimes those conflict each other, because, you know, the cash flow side would say that you do some grazing things that maybe isn't the best thing for the environment, but it produces the most pounds of beef that's what you need to do. But I think, and this isn't more of a question that didn't get asked, but more just a bit of advice is don't be afraid to go look. Don't be afraid to ask. I can remember when Brian brought me ventanata, and Brian and I worked together on a lot of things, but it was just one more thing and amongst a bunch of other things, and I didn't know how to necessarily attack it from did I not spend money on this so I could spend it on ventanata? Where did I go look? How did I go do it? And so I just started asking him questions. I started asking everybody questions. Get educated on what you're looking for and how you're going to deal with it, and then go get out there and look. Okay, you know, we're all on our ranch every day. We think we have this very intimate knowledge of our land, but we have a very intimate knowledge of our land from the forces that have been pulling on us, maybe not from answering these questions. So get out on your ranch with an open mind, look at it from a different mindset, how you're going to attack this problem, and then don't be afraid to ask for help and ask people's questions on how you're going to eat this elephant.
Well, I guess, you know, if I had to close it with anything, in the Great Basin, our number one concern is the loss of perennial grasses. And that is the key to suppressing those invasive weeds. So, you know, the habitats that were successful in the past and we're successful in now restoring and rehabilitating, those are going to be our key habitats in the future. We have habitats that we rehabbed in 1990s. And even though it's, you know, forage kochia, some wheatgrasses, some native bunch grasses, that forage kochia is taking the place of sagebrush. It's 33% of those mule deer diet. If we had been passive and absent back then, that habitat wouldn't be there today for them.
Yeah, that's pretty striking. That's a great question. I think the thing that came to my mind is I think at times there has been some stigma around invasive annual grass issues for ranchers, in that that if you have a cheatgrass problem, that you should have like a scarlet letter on your Carhartt jacket or something, that you've done something wrong. And you know, in some cases, our past management has probably led to exacerbating some invasive annual grass problems. I think if we go way back to before, like, we started learning about proper grazing management, probably did contribute. You know, historical grazing in the 30s. They're invasive because they're invasive. And so they're going to move into places whether you're managing things well or whether you're managing things poorly. We can definitely like accelerate that invasion by doing things poorly. But especially, I mean, some of the ventanata stuff we've seen very dense ventanata move into some very well managed rangelands. And so I think don't feel like you got to, you know, not make eye contact with people because you've got a cheatgrass problem or something like that. I mean, figure out if, do be realistic with yourself and figure out if your management practices are exacerbating that. But also don't feel like you have to like act like you don't have anything, because there are options to move forward. I think that's something that maybe I'm wrong in that assumption, but there in many cases, you know, you've been doing something wrong, and that's why you've got a weed problem. With some of these really problematic weeds, that is simply not the case.
I think those are perfect words to leave on tonight. And we were very, very fortunate to have you all join us. We're really thankful to be able to, again, pick your brain and be able to benefit from your guys' years of research and study on this topic. So thank you again for making time for this. It's certainly an issue and a topic that the Good Grazing Makes Sense team will continue to follow, because it's not going away, unfortunately, anytime soon, although we're rooting for that and we're hoping for that. But again, just if you all, the audience, got any benefit out of this conversation, this is really the goal of what Good Grazing Makes Sense is trying to do, is trying to bring everyone else's expertise to you. So again, we just encourage you to become a member so you can follow along. We'll post all of the resources that were mentioned from the discussion today, so that you can kind of go back into the comment section or the description and see all of that. Thank you again to our sponsors for making this all possible. Personally, I thoroughly enjoyed tonight, and I'll be watching this over and over again, I'm sure, throughout the next month as we kind of distribute it out to folks. But again, this is the benefit of the program, is that it's really driven by folks and their questions. And so again, we encourage you to join in with what we're trying to do, and please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you again for you all joining here tonight. So.
Yes, thanks everyone. And offline, but I want